Great. Thank you so much for the kind invitation. I'm really thrilled to be here today. Please feel free to ask questions at any point in time as I'm talking about this program. I really want this to be, an interactive conversation about the things we can do when we start thinking a little bit differently about teaching development programs, not only for graduate students, but also for faculty. So I'd be remiss before I start talking about SAGES to not really properly acknowledge the work of Ileana El-Khoury. She has been working with me on SAGES for over 5 years now in terms of developing the program, but also evaluating the program across the years. So I really wanted to acknowledge her hard work before I get started today. So SAGES is something that I implemented about 6 years ago at the University of Calgary, have now moved it to the University of Windsor, and we have been growing it over the last few years. We have now a number of institutions, both in Canada and the US, who have implemented SAGES, and we're looking to keep growing that. So I want to talk a little bit today about what the program is, but also the data that we have gathered and the surprising observations we've made over the last few years in looking at SAGES, but looking at the different changes, motivations that it has really inspired across the board in terms of our teaching faculty. So in terms of outcomes, there's really two things that I want to focus on today. And first, I'm going to be talking about how to conceptualize the design and implementation of a graduate student teaching development program at your institution, but also look at how structured graduate student faculty mentorship programs can actually be used to provide new educational development opportunities for academic staff. And this is really the surprising piece about SAGES. So our motivation or intention at the start of the day in terms of putting SAGES together and implementing it at the University of Calgary was to really enhance the opportunities that we were offering our graduate students in terms of, more structured formal opportunities to grow an evidence-based teaching practice. What we did not anticipate at the very beginning is the effect it would have on academic staff and their willingness to engage in teaching development as well. So a little bit about why these particular teaching development programs are important for graduate students. There's been a number of different studies published over the last 5 to 10 years now, really calling for us to think about how can we design, integrate into our graduate programs these types of professional development programs. So what's been shown is that by a number of groups, this is only a few of these studies, is that the development of proficiency and excellence in teaching has really become increasingly recognized by a number of institutions as a critical component of graduate education. So when we think about teaching, we're thinking about a number of transferable skills that our graduate students could use in a wide range of different career options that they may pick. It's also been shown by a number of teams, again, that graduate students can play really important roles in the retention of STEM majors in our specialized programs. So if we think about our introductory years in our undergraduate program, so years 1 and 2, our graduate students, for the most part, have more contact hours with our students than instructional staff. So they really become the face of our programs, if you can kind of think about it that way. Our students are interacting with them almost daily and looking at them as mentors, looking at them as guides as they're learning about the different contexts, the different content pieces that we're sharing with them in those particular courses. Now, there's a number of things that are already known about the effects of graduate student teaching development programs. So I'm going to share some of that with you. So one of the first pieces that's already known is that an instructor's pedagogical beliefs essentially impacts how they design, but also teach courses. But more importantly, this really has a huge impact on their decision to choose evidence-based teaching strategies like active learning. So what these studies have really taught us is that the earlier you can have these significant, impactful conversations with teachers, the more likely it is that they're going to adopt these perspectives, these beliefs that will really allow them to enthusiastically embrace different different evidence-based teaching approaches like active learning. What's also been shown is that students who've completed long-term professional development in STEM teaching have been shown to really make student-centered teaching a hallmark of their teaching practices, but it's also led to increased self-efficacy and altered teaching beliefs. And lastly, this was a study that came up just a few years ago. So Shortledge and Eddy essentially looked at a number of these graduate student teaching development programs across the US, so thousands of students. And what they found is that students who chose to complete graduate student teaching development programs actually had no impact in terms of their time to completion. It was actually the opposite. What they found is that students who spent time learning about teaching, learning about, how do you approach teaching, how do you approach assessment, they tended to actually finish their graduate programs earlier than students who did not. So the research question that I'm going to be talking with you about today and sharing data with you on today is whether establishing these graduate student faculty partnership support collaborative teaching development for both mentor and mentee. Now, I'm not here today to say, to really teach you anything new about the effects of graduate student teaching development programs. As I've mentioned, these effects have already been shown in the literature. What I'm here to share with you is, for the first time, we've been able to really showcase that these partnerships not only positively influence the development of teaching practices for our graduate students, but they also do the same for faculty mentors who choose to participate in the program. So I'll start with telling you a little bit about what Program SAGES is all about. So SAGES is an acronym that stands for SOTL Advancing Graduate Education in STEM. And there's a number of goals that we established when we implemented SAGES for the first time. So the first goal has really been driving the implementation of SAGES. What we wanted to do is we wanted to provide our graduate students with an introduction to the scholarship of teaching and learning with an emphasis on current pedagogical research in STEM. Now, when I started as a biology education researcher a number of years ago, I found that the transition going from more traditional disciplinary content to content that was dedicated to education research was very different. So in terms of how we do research, how we write it up, the types of methodologies, the types of statistical analyses that we employ are very different as compared to what you're typically used to as a graduate student in more traditional research areas. So we wanted to really create opportunities for graduate students to gain familiarity, to gain comfort with accessing that literature, reading it and analyzing it. We also wanted to set up a program where at its very core, we were really prioritizing mentorship opportunities. And the mentorship opportunities were there to support the development of evidence-based teaching practices within the context of specific scientific disciplines. So in the context of SOTL, what I love about SOTL is its diversity in that you can talk about teaching and learning research in a number of different areas with researchers across the globe. But what can be overwhelming is that when you're starting off as a novice instructor, is that when you're looking at different problems and different disciplines, it can get a little bit overwhelming. If you're coming from a STEM background and you're talking with someone who is from an arts background or another background that's very different from yours, the teaching strategies that they use might be a little different. The problems that they encounter as part of their teaching might be a little different. So we wanted to create opportunities for graduate students to start growing their practice within their own scientific discipline. We also wanted, as part of the program, to implement opportunities for students and mentors to develop educational leadership skills. So we did this by creating Program SAGES that has 4 key elements. The first key element that's part of Program SAGES is offering students authentic teaching opportunities. Now, teaching opportunities, our graduate students tend to have a fair number of them if they choose to become teaching assistants. Now, the thing about teaching opportunities in a lab or in a tutorial, those teaching experiences are very different than what a student would encounter if they were to teach a lecture. And what I found in my own practice and what I found in terms of being program director for SAGES over the last 6 years is that's the first thing my students will say is, I can't believe how different it is in terms of preparation, in terms of how it felt, teaching a lab versus teaching a lecture. So we really wanted to have a focus on offering our students these authentic opportunities to go into a class, regardless of the size, prepare a lecture, engage students, deliver that lecture, and assess their teaching based on that particular practicum. So what we did is we essentially oversaw mentoring partnerships, so the creation of mentoring partnerships between a graduate student mentee and an academic staff mentor. And those mentorship relationships are really the core of program SAGES. Without those mentorship relationships, SAGES simply could not exist. And I'm going to thank them at the end of this presentation, but I'm going to thank them again here is all the mentors who have generously given some of their time to share their expertise with our graduate students. Now, the third key element of program SAGES is the inclusion of a formal pedagogy course. So essentially what we have is a credit course that's offered in the fall term that essentially looks at the different, different types of research on teaching and learning, different types of approaches to teaching and learning, things like assessment, things like active learning, things like, how do you design a course? I'm going to give more examples about that in a few minutes. This last element is this peer network. And this is something that we weren't sure of its importance at the very beginning of our implementation of SAGES, but has become very important as we've looked at our program evaluation. And what we did at the very beginning is we chose to offer SAGES in such a way that students would be completing the program as a cohort. So they complete their formal pedagogy training in the first course together, and then they complete their teaching practicum together as well. And as part of that experience, they sit in on each other's teaching, they provide feedback to one another. And what we find is that this has really allowed for a very close-knit community to form across our SAGES scholars. And what I'm excited to see is that SAGES scholars from year one to new SAGES scholars are actually talking with one another and keeping in touch with one another, sharing different thoughts, sharing different ideas. So that's been a really nice piece of our program. So why is program SAGES important? Sorry, this should have been, I'm not sure. So that's sorry, that slide should have been removed. I apologize. I had some technical difficulties yesterday. So the SAGES program is made up of 4 different components. The first component is that we have a competitive application process. Now, I've been asked a number of times, why do you have this competitive application process for this program? The program does ask our graduate students to commit a certain amount of hours per week to developing their teaching practices. And we want to make sure that students are aware of that before they start the program, that they're aware of the expectations, that they're aware of the time commitment, and that they're ready to make that commitment. I know that our graduate students have very busy lives. They are juggling courses, they're juggling research, they're juggling a number of different things on top of that. So we want to make sure that they have the time they need to properly commit to the program. So we typically open up the program to about 30 to 35 positions a year, and we typically have anywhere between 100 to 150 applicants per year as well. So the first component is, as I mentioned earlier, the theory course. So here is where we have that pedagogy course where we look at a number of important concepts that relate to teaching and learning in STEM. And I'm going to provide you with a few more details about that in a minute. The second course, which is also another credit course, is their teaching practicum, which is typically done in the winter term. And the last component of the program is a SAGES symposium. So essentially what we do is every spring, summer, we host a teaching and learning conference where our SAGES scholars present on their teaching practicum. So they will look at a small SOTL question that they asked as part of their teaching practicum and collected data on, and they're going to share their experience of going through the teaching practicum, but also the data and conclusions that they have come to as part of that particular question that they asked. So a little bit of data as we're getting into the weeds of what Program Stages is all about. So why are graduate students interested in this program? So I'm going to share with you a quote from Carly, who was a SAGES scholar in the 2017-2018 year. And to her, she was saying that, well, we're applying research-based approaches in our STEM careers, but we aren't applying it enough to our teaching methods, and that needs to change. So to her, she was really taking SAGES because she wanted to be a part of the processes that will allow STEM education to evolve for the next generation of STEM students and educators. A little bit about some of our SAGES cohorts. So the 2016-2017 cohort was our very first cohort at the University of Calgary. We had 14 graduate students in our first cohort, all coming from various departments across the Faculty of Science. In the 2017-2018 cohort, we expanded. We were slowly growing the program. We were now at 22, and we were looking at expanding beyond the Faculty of Science, including faculties like kinesiology, medicine, and veterinary medicine, in addition to science. So Anna Ordog, who's actually gone on to win a number of institutional teaching awards, shared that she really enjoyed meeting weekly and having discussions with a group of peers who share her enthusiasm for teaching. Working with others who are passionate about improving their teaching skills was very motivating, and she felt renewed enthusiasm for approaching her TA role within our weekly conversations. So this is a feeling that we have gotten a lot of in our interviews with our graduate students over the last couple of years. Our 2018-2019 cohort was made up of 33 students, again, from a number of different faculties. And the diversity of the different faculties has really made for fascinating conversations on teaching and learning. And it's really lent itself to opportunities for graduate students to challenge each other's assumptions about teaching and learning. And I've learned a lot from them. And I really can't say thank you enough to each of these students for having participated in the program. Our 2019-2020 cohort, we had our biggest group to date. We had 35 students, again, from a variety of different STEM-related faculties. Our current cohort at the University of Windsor is made up of 15 students this year. This is its first year at the University of Windsor, and we have students from the Faculty of Science, but from almost all the departments in science as well. So it's really nice to see, again, a really great group of enthusiastic students excited to learn about teaching and learning. So I want to share a little bit with you the topics that make up our pedagogy course in the fall term. So we cover things like current research on student learning in STEM. We look at trying to instill within our students an appreciation for reflection. And, coming from a STEM background, sitting down and actually writing reflective paragraphs on your teaching is not something that comes very naturally. But it's something that in building your teaching practice is really important. So we go through different ways in which you can reflect on your teaching practice, different ways in which you can gather evidence that shows the effectiveness of your teaching practice as well. We then look at elements of course design, look at how do you select and implement different active learning strategies depending on your content and your context. We also look at approaches for student assessment, student engagement, effective use of technology for teaching, teaching problem solving, evaluating teaching approaches, and finally, the course as a capstone ends with asking students to write a teaching philosophy statement and starting to prepare a teaching portfolio. So we do this over the course of a term. We meet with students once a week for 3 hours. And I really want to again acknowledge all the many colleagues that have helped me in Calgary as we put this program together and offered these different workshops with me every week since the program's introduction. Now, the teaching practicum is the second course. So the first course was the pedagogy course, which is a credit course. The second course is their teaching practicum, also a credit course. And for their teaching practicum, each scholar is asked to select a course within their disciplinary context. So as part of the work that they do, they are asked to talk with the instructor that is assigned to that course and have conversations with that person, inviting them to participate in program stages. So we really want to give our SAGES scholars the opportunity to initiate those conversations, have those meetings where they're going to be talking with that instructor and starting to chart the course for their teaching practicum. Now, the practicum involves redesigning, delivering, and assessing one unit in that particular course. And one unit is equivalent to 3 50-minute classes. And we let our SAGES scholars know that we want them to focus on the lecture component of the course and not the lab. Again, because our students have lots of experience as graduate student teaching assistants, we want to get them in the class, in front of students with that new experience of, facing the crowd. How do you interact with them? How do you deliver content? How do you engage your students? Now, the teaching practicum really has 4 main components to it, or 4 main pieces that allow this to work. So, of course, we've got our SAGES scholar, who is the student who's completing the practicum. The SAGES scholar will be asked to create lesson plans and an assessment strategy for that particular unit that they are redesigning and delivering. And they're going to be asked to reflect on their experience throughout the process. The mentor is the person who will be sharing their experience with the mentee. We've created a handbook for our mentors to let them know the type of time commitment that they are looking at and the expectations of our mentors as well. They're going to be invited to provide feedback on their mentees' lesson plans, but also the assessment strategy. We have a SAGES program facilitator. So that person will provide feedback on the lesson plans and assessment strategy as well, and essentially is a point person for the program in terms of answering questions both from the mentor and the mentee. And the program facilitator will also observe one lesson in the practicum, typically the last one. We also have a peer. So this is another student in the program who will come and observe the lesson in the practicum and also reflect on the experience of observing someone else teaching and how that has impacted their own teaching development. So this is a screenshot of the lesson plan template that we've developed for our SAGES scholars. So it is very much goal orientated. We're asking our students to set up goals for themselves. What do they want to accomplish as part of this teaching practicum? What is success going to look like for them? We have a number of sessions within our first pedagogy course on how to write learning outcomes or learning objectives. So the lesson plan has the standard elements of time, activities, and resources. But what's really the kind of the focus of these lesson plans is really giving them time to reflect on what worked well, what needs revisions, and whether or not they think their learners met the learning objectives. So a few more pieces of data from our SAGES scholars in terms of asking them to describe their experience working in partnership with a mentor. So Petra, she described it as really being a great experience because she felt she was considered more like an equal in terms of her opinions. And she was given the freedom in making course-related decisions. And this is something that, is really, I'm really thankful for our mentors for creating those opportunities and creating those environments where our mentees are feeling that they are welcomed as part of their courses. In terms of how did their mentors support them in terms of adapting to the unexpected, as I'm sure most of us can relate to, when you start teaching, you kind of think that, well, you've spent hours and hours preparing a lesson, so everything's going to go well. Well, sometimes it doesn't quite go as planned. So really giving them the chance to have someone there when maybe sometimes things don't go quite as planned. And what do you do? So how do you reshape a lesson, right away, so that you can still meet the needs of your learners in that particular course. So here's a little bit of some photos of our very first SAGES Celebration of Teaching and Learning Symposium. This has been an annual event. So our students prepare essentially a poster that they present to the entire university community. We will be hosting it at the University of Windsor, hopefully in September. We're waiting to see what's going to happen with COVID, but we're quite excited to be hosting our students and giving them the opportunity to share what they've learned, but also share, their projects that they've done as part of their teaching practicum. Now, in terms of evaluating the effectiveness of SAGES, we did it with a mixed methods approach. So we had 2 surveys. That one of them was the Trigwell and Prosser survey on teaching inventory approaches. The other one was one that was designed to measure self-efficacy for STEM graduate student teaching assistants. These particular surveys were administered to ensure that the program was meeting and essentially mimicking some of the results that had already been published in the literature on graduate student teaching development programs. We also followed up with with interviews, so individual interviews with both mentors and mentees, and this is where we found the unexpected effects on our mentors. So giving you a little bit of an overview of the data that we found. So the first survey, so the Trigwell and Prosser survey, what we found is that before starting the SAGES program, most of our students held very teaching or teacher-centered approaches as part of their teaching repertoire. After completing SAGES, we had most of them completely change their approach to adopt more of a student-centered approach or student-centered strategies to their teaching, as opposed to more teacher-centered strategies or approaches. So this, again, was something that was very much mirroring what was seen already in the literature and made us feel confident that we had, in fact, put together the right elements inside our program so that students were reaching those goals that we wanted them to reach at the end of it. In terms of the second survey, so this was really focused on self-efficacy. So we analyzed that through the application of a MANOVA test. So what we found is that we had statistically significant effects on our graduate students' self-efficacy. Some of the questions, I'm not going to go through each of them here in detail, but some of the questions related to promoting student participation, so encouraging student engagement, looking at how do you let students take initiative for their own learning, again, looking at that student-centered teaching approach, you're looking at evaluation, looking at students as active learners. So what we found was that in each of those cases, we had statistically significant differences that showed that upon completion of SAGES, we were seeing these changes, these positive changes in attitude, in self-efficacy, but also in approach. Now, the interviews is where things get a little bit more interesting. So we did thematic analyses of the interviews with both the SAGES scholars and the SAGES mentors. So I'm going to start with the SAGES scholars. So in terms of the SAGES scholars, 2 of the themes that kept coming up through our interviews was very distinct changes in terms of their definition of teaching. So we had some of our SAGES scholars say things like, prior to the SAGES program, teaching was more, here's the content, give it to the students. But after SAGES, it was more like this particular scholar says, I saw that there are lots of things that you can learn, lots that you can do in the classes, not just repeating everything. It's so active. So again, really looking at them adopting active learning strategies within their practices so that they can engage with their learners. They can get excited about learning with their learners. Another important theme that was coming up was changes in their identity. So they really started to see themselves as individuals who inspire students. So I really like the second quote, so that a teacher is not a lecturer only, not a facilitator. They were something in between those two. They also mentioned as another theme, different definitions of effective teaching. So they saw effective teaching as including things like interactivity, connecting information. So things like scaffolding assignments, having a variety of exercises, creating safe spaces, adopting active learning, being very organized, were themes that kept coming up in our conversations with our scholars. Carly again said that using evidence-based strategies gave her the confidence she needed to implement creative and non-traditional lecture styles into the classroom. The lecture was really well received, and we're now talking about publishing the series of lectures on CourseSource, which is a really exciting opportunity, and it wouldn't have been possible without the SAGES program. So really getting them excited to become involved in SOTL and making their teaching practices public, which is an amazing outcome. Two more themes for these conversations related to, again, reflection. So them embracing the importance of becoming reflective practitioners. So writing down a few notes after their teaching so that they can go back and say, am I improving? Am I getting worse? What have I learned as a teacher? So one of the students says, I think the students made it through the lab component better because I just took stock of what I was doing. We had students adopting very different views of assessments. So not just looking at assessment of learning, but assessment for learning, assessment as learning were things that were coming up as themes within our interviews with our student mentees. Jesselyn shared, in hindsight, this seems totally silly, but I also really didn't know what SOTL was before SAGES. I always thought of teaching as an iterative or reflective process where you'd improve over time. But the idea of collecting and analyzing data on teaching never really occurred to me. But now I feel it'll be hard to separate good teaching from SOTL. So Jesselyn went and was successful in getting institutional funding to actually lead a study in her biostatistics course. I just reviewed her paper a couple months ago that she's submitting based on her teaching practicum that she's expanded over a number of years to really look at the effect of the particular intervention that she introduced in that biostatistics class. It's really nice to see how they're running with it now and really making an impact on others. The interviews from mentors is really where the data was previously unreported. So the effects that we'll be talking about here are something that we are very excited about. This is under consideration for publication as we speak right now. One of the themes that came out from our mentors was that our mentors saw the mentees coming to mentor them. And this was something that we had never seen before. What we saw from our interviews with our mentors is that they saw the mentees coming into their courses and creating safe environments for them to think about teaching development. So one of our mentors shared, my mentee is very much more steeped in teaching and thinking about teaching than I am. I think, if I didn't agree with her, I think it would be good because I would basically try that. I respect her feedback as the better teacher. Another mentor shared, I've been teaching for 28 years, so I'm used to giving the standard lecture, and that's all I ever got as a student way back when. By having this involvement with my mentee, she had taken all this. She'd have obviously learned some new ideas and approaches, and we got even more innovative than I had originally planned, I think, because of that. So this mentor, who had been teaching very traditionally, very teacher-focused approaches for 28 years, ended up completely flipping their course with their mentee and has actually sustained that flipped learning approach since 2016, 2017. Another theme that came out was that our mentors really appreciated the opportunity to learn and adopt new teaching strategies. So Allison shared in her role, she found that she has a hard time finding time to come up with new ideas and teaching methods. So I think a program like this can help faculty people with alternate techniques. I just don't have the time normally to say, oh, I'm going to try this new technique and then spend this extra time to try to figure out how to implement it. Having a student come in and do that and show how that's done would be very useful when you don't have a lot of time to spend on it. Our mentors also became much more reflective teachers. So here we had Mark sharing, you can sit back and see how students receive the instruction, and that's also very instructive. So Michael shared, I think my course is too traditional. My teaching style is just not interactive enough and not engaging. I really like to develop that further. It's because the experience with my mentee has got me thinking more about that. So this idea of working with our SAGES scholars as being sources of a spark to really get things going in terms of looking at their teaching, looking at their courses a little bit differently. Our mentors also started to begin to shift their teaching identities. So Andrew shared teaching it more as a pedagogy rather than a how do you get to the end point and what steps do you need to get to. I think that thinking about learning is a good thing. Having my mentee do that, having her influenced, helped. So what we're really seeing here is our mentors are becoming much more engaged in terms of faculty development. What we saw over the few years that it was in Calgary is that whenever we would give a talk about SAGES, inviting people to become involved in the program, the number of people coming would increase as people would see this as an opportunity to really rethink and redesign their courses. And I've had some people talk about this as essentially stealth faculty development. And it kind of is a little bit. It really wasn't the intent of Program SAGES. The intent of Program SAGES was really to focus on our graduate students. But what we're finding is that our graduate students somehow created the right environment that allowed our faculty members to really open up their teaching practices and start thinking about what things can they change, what different ways can they try to deliver content, to engage their learners, to become more excited about their teaching. So in terms of by the numbers, we've had 150 students now complete the program. We've had a number of students in different institutions as well. We've had 94 undergraduate courses redesigned. That's really reached over 5,000 students. We've had 147 faculty mentors to date. And we've had 4 facilitators actually receive educational leadership growth opportunities as well through the process. A few more kudos. We've had 7 mentees win institutional teaching awards after program completion. 2 of our mentors have now won faculty level teaching awards. One won a faculty level educational leadership award. 7 of our scholars have gone on to become successful co-applicants on institutional SOTL grants. And we've got 15 of our scholars that are now in tenure track positions, and their hiring committees specifically told them that having completed SAGES put them on top of the shortlist. So they had a formal, recognized program that was dedicated to teaching. It shows up on their transcript. So they had a formal completion of a program that helped them with thinking about their teaching as they were setting up in their academic career. So in terms of conclusions, what pedagogical programs like SAGES have shown is that they can serve to build really broad networks of engagement between graduate students and faculty mentors, where both mentees and mentors can collaboratively enhance their teaching practices. And this is really the first time that this has been shown. It aligns with some of the research that Roxa and Martinson have published, where they really advocated for creating these safe spaces that would allow for these significant conversations about teaching and learning to happen. Because a lot of us in STEM fields are not used to talking about our teaching. Our teaching practices, for the most part, when we're thinking about STEM contexts, are very private. We don't have those conversations about, I have this issue in my class. How do I fix it? For a lot of us, admitting to an issue in our teaching means that there's a problem and we shouldn't have problems. But really, it's starting to change our thinking about how can we learn about problems or different opportunities collectively. What can we learn from one another? What can we try in our classes to really make for more positive environments for our students, to allow our students to reach that deeper learning that we want them to get to. So this is really what we're super excited about in terms of SAGES, is the opportunity to connect different people on teaching and really have those conversations that lead to change and lead to sustained change over the years. So in looking back at our key elements of program stages, so again, we're looking at authentic teaching opportunities for our graduate students where they are going into the classroom in a class within their disciplinary context. Where they're going to be teaching a unit that they've redesigned under the mentorship of an academic staff mentor. And they can do that because they've built some skills, they've gotten knowledge through a formal pedagogy course. And they're also growing their teaching practices through this peer network where they have each other to ask questions, they have each other to sit in on their teaching, provide each other with feedback, and then keep growing as they're looking at developing their teaching practices. So now that I've kind of listed off and described the 4 key elements of the SAGES program, I'd really like to invite you to think about your own campus community and think about, do you already have individual programs that address one or more of these areas separately? Who's the program's target audience? Are they instructional or research faculty? Are we looking at graduate or undergraduate students? And inviting you to kind of think about how can you highlight key goals and outcomes for each program, but more importantly, can you start building bridges between these different programs so that you can offer something similar to SAGES within your own context at Dalhousie University? So references, and I'd be remiss again to not acknowledge some of my great collaborators. So Dr. Sean Stoughton and Michael Weiser have been amazing in terms of helping me build this program, the multiple SAGES cohorts and faculty mentors, and also financial support from the University of Calgary when the program was just getting set up as well. I am welcoming your questions, and you could also feel free to contact me. That's my email address and Twitter handle, and I'd be most happy to talk with you about SAGES.